we don't dive anything, we're essentially killing ourselves slowly from chronic disease of lifestyle that really comes from confusion and misinformation. Either way, the economic implications are staggering, both nationally and individually. No matter what, I know we can agree that things have changed. Now is the time to take charge of your health and the health of your children. And I want you to think about this. If you're depressed, it doesn't mean you're deficient in Prozac. Why are we seeing such a dramatic increase in chronic illness? My name is Debi Waldeck, and I'm creator of the Saving Generation Next project. The purpose of the Saving Generation Next project is to teach preventative health because I don't see any kind of comprehensive education really anywhere. It's certainly not in the schools. We're not getting it from the 5-minute excerpts on the TV shows. But we need to learn the language of the body so we can recognize early red flags and warning signs of impending diagnosis and take charge of our health, which takes knowledge. Now, you may wonder, how did Debi become so passionate, interested, or even commissioned to speak about preventative health? Well, many years ago, I was diagnosed with Graves' disease. And Graves' disease is an autoimmune disease like MS or rheumatoid arthritis, and it's when the body attacks itself. My resting heart rate was 156 because my body had, quote unquote, attacked the thyroid. Now, I was young, and they didn't want to do radiation because I was of childbearing years, so I was prescribed a drug. Unfortunately, they didn't know at the time that that medication could cause complications in the heart of an unborn child. Shortly after starting the medication, I became pregnant. And unfortunately, through the course of my pregnancy, I was told to abort the baby after what was seen on an ultrasound. And I got to tell you, I was afraid. How many of you are afraid because of a quote-unquote diagnosis? Well, the reality is that I really fell to my knees. And I heard a still, small, sweet voice. For me, it was God that said, "You will have a healthy baby boy." And I was even told his name. I spent a lot of time in solitude, and I realized that by focusing our soul inward, we actually encounter God. In fact, I think the truth. And authenticity is really about our relationship with ourselves. Oh, people talk about being alone, but loneliness isn't the absence of company. It's the grief over its absence. What are you doing when in those quiet moments? And I realize our decision-making is powerfully influenced by social contact, by the media, by what our friends say. And I had a whole lot of friends that told me I needed to abort and listen to the doctors. And I realized that solitude allows us to explore our own integrity. Well, in the end, I chose not to listen. But our son was born with a significant heart complication. It was a large ventricular septal defect that wasn't expected to close. Now, luckily, in the end, it would have presented like a heart murmur, but what it did is on this heart, on the right is the heart with a problem, on the left is normal. Now, in the heart, there's all these chambers, and I'll make it simple, but this red blood is what comes from the lungs. That LV stands for left ventricle. The right ventricle is where blood has come from the body, which is why it's blue. It needs oxygen. And so it's going to go from the right ventricle into the lungs to get oxygen and then come back down to the left side. When there's a hole, that blood will then fall into the right ventricle and then go up into the lungs, but with oxygen in it. And this causes problems like pulmonary hypertension and so many other things. Well, for us, a miracle was experienced. In fact, when our son was 13 months old, after seeing the cardiologist every other month in Richmond, Virginia, with no change, the hole had spontaneously closed. It was a miracle. And I remember being so grateful. And I also realized that even though we had experienced that miracle, our children for the next 7 years suffered from these chronic conditions that for some may be minor inconveniences. But in that, I realized that the only answers were inhalers, steroid cream, antibiotics, drugs. And you know what? No one could tell me why they had these problems in the first place. So I had to research. And I remember asking, if I'm to have a healthy baby boy, then why am I going through these things? And I remember hearing People will go and receive, quote unquote, a healing on faith, but maybe walk out and in ignorance do things they don't even realize are making them sick and lose their healing. And what does that do for our faith? So I realized there was a reason for my research. And I used to laugh. I had Dr. Oz's protocol figured out way back in the 90s. I knew about food colorings and sugar and healthy oils and all that. But you know what? Our kids weren't getting better. And I realized that we didn't know everything. In fact, the food pyramid doesn't even exist anymore. In June 2011, it's now become the plate, which is great. This is a great, great way to teach our children how to eat. But the reality is that I needed answers, and my kids weren't getting better. And the only answers were drugs, and no one could tell me why. So I began to journal everything going in and everything going out and all behaviors in between. And I remember something. And here I asked my son to write his name, and I gave him a little peanut butter. 15 minutes later, he can't even spell it. Yet, this is a guy that's diagnosed with ADHD. Now, if this is true, but I can cause it based on what he's eating, is it really ADHD? And how many of you have kids or conditions that you're being medicated for, but you may not really understand the root reason why you have it? Well, the reality is, I'm just glad I didn't listen. Because after doing all that research, here's what happened. I started asking this question, what is good health? And I realized that there really isn't a definition of good health. In fact, the dictionary says it's not sick. So that's it, sick, not sick. But did you know that there's red flags and warning signs every step of the way before you're finally diagnosed with that condition? And if somebody told you the roadmap, you maybe could go a different path. I needed to find the missing link between sick and not sick, ease and dis-ease. And I know we would agree that we are seeing a dramatic increase in all these conditions, and it's not genetic. In fact, what I found is that these conditions that are growing so dramatically can't be blamed on genetics alone. In fact, they may be normal, but it's absolutely not natural. And guess what? All of these conditions, they have one common denominator. And again, it's not your genetics, it's not vaccines, it's not that you're near high power lines. What is it? Whether you have something as minor as allergies to as severe as cancer, you have one thing in common. You're not digesting, absorbing, and assimilating your nutrition properly. So it's not just what we eat or what goes on the plate, quote unquote, but what happens once we put what's on our plate into our stomach. That's why 2 kids eat peanut butter and they don't have the same response. What was different in my child? What's different when 2 women walk into the mall, smell perfume, and one gets a migraine headache, the other one doesn't? There's a profound relationship between wellness and absorption. And I found that this relationship between overall health and the health of the intestinal tract can be summed into one sentence. The gut trains the immune system. So what did I do? I applied these principles, and that child that had those conditions became 100% whole, healthy, and in fact, some years later received a congressional appointment to the United States Military Academy. I'm blessed to have had the opportunity that I was able to take 4 years off and to put this into a book and to start the Saving Generation Next project. So if you have conditions with autoimmune diseases, ADHD, a hyperactive immune system with asthma, eczema, and so on, you need to learn about the Saving Generation Next project and get Saving Generation Next. You know, when the crisis had passed, I remember thinking, okay, how can I maintain youth and vitality effortlessly? And you know what? When you understand the language of the body, you can definitely do that. And so I was able to write Forever Young and Vibrant to share that information with others. And you know what? When energy became effortless, well, then we began to seek excellence financially. And I realized, you know, people who retire at 45 live a long, long time, and those who work till their ripe old age don't. And then we got 62% of our population relying on Social Security when we're turning around and spending another $300 to $400 out of our $1,280 on drugs. You guys, this is crazy. And I found that our relationship with ourselves affects all relationships, even our relationship with money. This is not a money book. It's a book about you and how that inner dialogue is affecting every relationship that you've had. It talks about the trust, forgiveness, love connection, and creating new I am statements. But in all that, I ask you, don't become desensitized. And help me spread the word and become an agent of change. Facebook this. Tweet this, share it. Because in the end, God cannot direct any of our steps if we're not stepping. So you ask, what's in it for you? Well, I have to apologize. The one thing I can promise you is this is not a 140-character tweet. Unfortunately, I can't do this in 2 minutes, 5 minutes. It's a journey. And so what I've done is I've created 23 free webinars that'll be live every other Monday through 2012. Now, all the webinars will be recorded and hosted at debiwaldeck.com if you miss it. But this is really 52 weeks to a new you that discusses bone density, depression, finances, because everything is the same. Now, the resources are my books. The resources are my blog. But I want you to remember that Saving Generation Next begins with us. And I want to thank you as we move forward, Saving Generation Next, by starting right now with you and me.